So we'll just
John,
start.
you're on mute.
Yeah. On mute. Is it on now?
And I think you're just really quiet, John.
Yeah, okay. That's
Nobody
so
has
usual.
ever said that to you ever. I know that's going to be a bit of a shock.
It's not a norm, is it? Can you hear me now?
That's better.
Is that better? There you go. Right. Morning, everybody. Welcome to this session, which is exploring issues around exploitation of people through and looking at modern slavery session, which is being presented by myself, John Binding. I'm the interim strategic lead for adult safeguarding for Waltham Forest Council, and my colleague Angela.
I head up quality in the London Borough of Waltham Forest for Adult Social Care Commission services in Borough.
Great, thank you. So I don't want to death by PowerPoint, but I'm going to put that in the back. So the background, you'll have it, and then I'll talk to it. But I'll share it now, and then we'll talk about what the agenda for the session is, the objectives. And then I want to start off with a quick kind of anything you wanted to ask, but we're a little afraid to ask. Anything you want to know but afraid to ask session. So you could put some questions either in the chat or indeed put your hand up and we'll capture those. Because I think the idea is at the end of this, then hopefully we've answered any kind of queries that you may have. Because as much as we've got everything down in a PowerPoint presentation and slides, which will make sure go out to everybody, I think it's always really good if somebody puts something in there that we've not covered in the slides. We can either add to it or indeed come back to you if we don't know it. We know a fair bit, but we don't know everything. So that as a guide. So, okay, so let's share. Okay then. So here we're off. Is that working? Is that working,
yep.
Catherine? Yeah, all good. So identifying and supporting victims of employment exploitation based on exploitation in Waltham Forest. So Angela's going to set the scene.
Okay. So I would say it was probably approximately about 6 months ago, we received a notification of allegations of modern day slavery, which was impacting. We had names and we had part addresses, contact details for individuals, but these individuals were based all around the country. There was one individual that was cited as a resident of Waltham Forest. The issue that we had was that the provider wasn't known to us and the individual wasn't known to us, and we didn't have a pathway in place in order to effectively manage this this situation. And hence this pathway, which we're going to be talking you through today, was developed in order to manage such situations going forward. Since that one, we have had multiple and many concerns flagged with us regarding potential modern day slavery. And obviously we've refined our pathway accordingly each time we've received a different whistleblowing, for etc. coming through. So most recent one, and as we're finding, is primarily around home care agencies. Some of the allegations have come from residents directly, i.e. carers have told them and they flagged it with the council, or the employees of the home care agencies have contacted the local authority. In terms of the first one that I mentioned, it was actually false information that had been given to us, so no problems there. John, is there anything else you want me to add to that?
No, that's all good. That's all good. Thanks for that, Angela. Obviously, you'll be chipping in as we go along. So just to cover, as we said, the welcome introduction. Ta-da, we've just done that. So we're going to cover what does modern slavery look like today, because Angela just pointed out modern day slavery doesn't look like it perhaps looked in 2004. If people remember the Morecambe Bay cockling incident where a number of Chinese nationals died, who are kind of regarded as illegal immigrants. Remember that? So there's been a number of different faces of modern day slavery as it's progressed, leading to the one that we're seeing now, both in Waltham Forest and nationally, which is kind of an exploitation of the government sponsorship arrangements. Going to cover some of the legislation statistics that show with that, the numbers. Then, as Angela talked about, a pathway to responding to alleged exploitation, what to do with it. I'm going to spend a little time talking about making a referral to the National Referral Mechanism. So some of you will know what that is, some of you perhaps don't, but by the end of today you will. Signposting support for victims of employment-based exploitation, Q&A session, and then access to resources. And as we say, the slides will go out to everybody with it. So please don't be scrabbling away writing stuff down. These will be coming out to you shortly after this session. So the objectives of the training session are to equip professionals with the knowledge, tools to identify and support victims of employment-based exploitation, provide a comprehensive understanding of the resources and services available to victims in Waltham Forest, foster a collaborative approach among professionals to ensure victims receive the necessary support and justice. And these outcomes and objectives aim to empower professionals to effectively support victims and contribute to the broader effort of combating employment-based exploitation. So that's what you came for, hopefully in the right session. So that said, crack on and get this to work. Is it not working? Why is it not working? There we go. So as I mentioned, it'd be really helpful if you could put in the chat or put your hand up if I'm able to identify it. Any kind of key queries that you've got that you would like this session to be addressing or answering. We'll give a couple of minutes for this, because otherwise Angela and I will just rattle on for another at least 45 minutes with it. But it'd be really good if we can kind of home some of this into kind of key questions that you may have or queries. So if your digits are struggling, by all means put your hand up. Have we got any hands up?
Can't see any, and there's nothing in the chat. Can't see anyone typing.
No.
Oh. So we've got defining modern day slavery and having the information to share with clients.
Okay. Yeah, I think we. Yeah, I think we got that covered. I think we got that covered. We can kind of check. Anything else? Okay. Another minute. Kind of do this now because the danger is people start putting stuff in the chat as you crack on, and then it can be a little bit kind of take your attention away from what you're talking about. So I would say if you've not managed to capture it now, if you could kind of hang on to the end when we have the bit of a question and answering questions. Catherine.
So we've had a couple of comments in the chat.
Okay.
So we've had reporting lines. So how to report concerns
Yep.
about modern slavery. What are the new trends, which was a little bit touched upon by Angela, and what are the signs of modern slavery?
Great. Oh, I feel like we can head on with great confidence because I think we've got most of that covered. However, we think we have, but if you want to come back at the end of it and go, yeah, I'm not so sure, John, then please do that, and we'll add, because it might be we can add to the slides before we send it round to make sure we've got it, because I think we want to use this as a tool that you can all use and disseminate. Right then, shall we move on? So, modern slavery training, what is it? So modern slavery is an umbrella term encompassing slavery, servitude, forced or compulsory labour, and human trafficking. Victims of modern slavery are unable to leave their situation of exploitation, controlled by threats, punishment, violence, coercion, and deception. So that won't be a shock to anybody that's been either reading up things or actually touched upon cases. Slavery violates human rights, denying people their right to live, to life, to freedom and security. Modern slavery is said to be hidden in plain sight, and you'll see that as we go along. I think it's very unusual that we get a scenario where we get approached in adult social care where somebody's coming to tell us about that scenario. Often these situations come around through either involvement of licensing, going into premises, or any kind of involvement of the police quite often. Or sometimes it's neighbours tell us about a situation. So we might have a tenancy that seems to have an awful lot of people living there, way beyond the 2 people that the council have down on their records, which would say to you, we started to see, certainly in my doing this job of adult safeguarding lead for a number of years now, we've had some situations where we've been notified by the post office, for example, the Royal Mail, where they've been delivering parcels and realised there's an awful lot of people that seem to be using that address. Sometimes that's for scams, but sometimes it's been around this kind of scenario. So many of us will have unknowingly seen the victims, perpetrators, or effects of slavery in our day-to-day life. Modern slavery is difficult to identify, and we still have a lot to learn about the nature of slavery in Waltham Forest. I think we certainly do. What we know from the statistics is it's definitely out there, but I think how hard are we looking, and are the right people familiar with the indicators and what to look for? So for this reason, we're committed to tackling modern slavery in Waltham Forest through the following 3 aims, which is tackling modern slavery through strong leadership and effective partnerships, making sure this is on the agenda, because I think sometimes it slips off the agenda and then there'll be a significant incident that makes us all get back on board to some degree. Raising awareness of modern day slavery through sessions like this. Conscious it's only an hour session, so it's only going to be raising the appetite really, and hopefully people will go off and have a look at when the slides come out, look at some of the cases. By identifying and supporting victims of modern slavery, and we'll have a session around indicators with that. That's right. Okay, so what does it look like? So Angela talked to then around cases that we're now seeing around exploitation of the government initiative around sponsorships. But modern slavery can look like sexual exploitation. People will recall some years ago the incidents of pop-up brothels where people were exploited in those situations. We have forced labour, and that might be where there's one incident, we'll come on to the case examples, of a family that were keeping a number of vulnerable people that they'd found through sleeping homeless, or people with mild learning disability, where they were forcing them to do things like tarmacking roads, or indeed down some of the organisations like Norfolk Way, where you had farming and people used along those lines. Domestic servitude, I've had none of those situations where people have been brought over into the UK with better quality of life, but they've actually lived as a live-in, kind of started as an au pair, for example, and then basically they've not been allowed out and they've been exploited for that, either free childcare or domestic work. Forced criminality. We've seen forced criminality along the lines of cuckooing and things like that, when people are kind of expected. So sometimes they'll take advantage of people that may have addictions with alcohol or drugs, and therefore they're forced to go out and commit crimes to do things, but it's exploitation. Organ harvesting was a very national case a little while ago where somebody came over from Nigeria. There was clear expectation that there was going to be an operation where organs would be harvested, but that person hadn't signed up for that. But we're starting to see those. And of course, forced marriage. We're seeing more of that. Forced marriage isn't new, but I think beginning to see it much more along the lines of modern slavery along that. And child slavery. So child slavery, you'll be familiar with, around county lines and scenarios where people are exploited, young people, to often be other parts of the country, with very little payback for that. And often these young people should be, are expected to be in school. So it's taken on a number of different faces, but certainly the most recent for us is the exploitation of the government sponsorship arrangements. So the United Nations reports that human trafficking involves 3 elements: the act, which is recruitment, transport, transfer, harbouring, and the receipt of persons; the means, so threat or use of force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, and abuse of power or vulnerability; and the purpose, exploitation. And as we come on later on, you'll see that fits perfectly with some of the people that are coming to our attention that have come to the UK with the expectation of working. And it might be that they've borrowed money or collated money to pay to an individual to arrange that sponsorship bit with an expectation that they pay back somebody, but then when they get to the UK, that's not available to them, and there's exploitation. I've certainly come across one case from my last borough where somebody was being sexually exploited and being told, if you don't go along with this, I will report you to CQC. You will never work again. I'll refer you to all these different agencies, and you'll be going back where you came from, and you've lost loads of money if you don't go along with what I'm asking you to do. Lots of really awful situations. But the government has described modern slavery as a brutal form of organised crime in which people are treated as commodities and exploited for criminal gain, which takes a number of forms, including sexual exploitation, forced labour, and domestic servitude. So I'm going to whiz through some of the case examples. So people have been around for a little while, you'll remember some of these and going, oh yeah, gosh. So I mentioned earlier, so in 2004, we had the Morecambe Bay Cockling tragedy. Victims, which is almost like 20 odd years now ago, but that brought in some legislative change following that. But I think then as a nation, people were really quite horrified. And if people remember, they were out collecting cockles and the tide came in and it was dark and a number of people had drowned, 21 illegal Chinese immigrants drowned. Pretty shocking. But that then nationally, people start to go, okay, we need to legislation with that. 2015, I've missed that. This could have been 15 slides long, but I wanted to break it up. So in 2015, we had the Perivale doctor and nurse guilty of keeping man as slave for 24 years. A Nigerian man had brought to the UK at the age of 14 to look after the couple's children and clean the home. Promised an English education, but was instead made to work with a warning that if he left the house or went to the police, he'd be arrested for being an illegal immigrant. Now, we've had a couple of these where the people that have actually been the perpetrators have been pillars of society. So a Perivale doctor and nurse, they were a married couple. In 2017, we had another shocking incident which was hit the national news, and that was a traveller family by the name of Rooney, jailed for modern slavery offences, and that was family kept 18 men between the ages of 18 and 63 with vulnerabilities in squalid conditions and made them work with violence being used to enforce this. The victims were often homeless and had been picked up by the defendants from across the UK. So that was everywhere. And it was people that had addictions, it was people with mild learning disability, and it's people that were street homeless. We have our own, very own Waltham Forest incident in 2019, which was a case that's progressed through adult safeguarding, and that related to a woman who ran a cat charity, and she'd been keeping this individual basically locked up within her own home and taking all her money and getting her to do all the domestic bits. And I remember that case when I was here last time as it started its way through an adult safeguarding process. Then we have in 2019 again, 3 convicted of trafficking, landmark county lines case. And we're now starting to see county lines and those young people identified in that as certainly more as victims, as opposed to that issue around adultification, really. So quite often these are young children with it, and also be involved in criminality. But that was the first incident of the organised gang leaders being fined and using modern slavery legislation. In 2023, we had the organ trafficking plot with, again, a politician and wife, and there's a Nigerian politician, if you remember that one, in 2023. And then some recent ones in 2024, people remember last year, McDonald's and the supermarkets failed to spot slavery. And they had a situation where a gang forced 16 victims to work at either the fast food restaurant or the factory, which supplies Asda, Co-op, M&S, Sainsbury's and Tesco and Waitrose. For that, there was some horrific bits to that. So you had people that were coming for jobs that were not able to speak English, but had an interpreter that they brought along themselves. What they discovered from that was, for example, several of these people used the same address, and several of these people had their salaries paid into the same bank account, which should have been a bit of a warning. And in 2025, as mentioned, we've now got migrant workers in limbo of employment license crackdown, and we'll come on to that, where people have come along to sponsorship arrangements, which haven't quite worked out as suggested. So the legislation bit is, we have the Modern Slavery Act 2015, which gives law enforcement agencies the tools to tackle modern slavery. And you'll hear this a lot, really, certainly when these cases are being addressed. So it includes maximum life sentences for perpetrators and enhanced for protections for victims. And the protection for victims includes access to the legal system to support victims. So impose a duty on UK-based businesses who make a turnover of I think it's 300,000 to make transparent the action they take to ensure their own business and their supply chains are free of modern slavery, and the effectiveness of those actions. So you'll see a lot of companies now will have a modern slavery acknowledgement around that they do check. So this has led to a significant increase in the number of national referral mechanism referrals, which we'll talk about in a minute, which came into being in 2009 with that. It's also led to an increase in live police operations and general modern day slavery linked prosecutions by the Crown Prosecution Service. So they're certainly busy. One of the things that came out of the Morecambe Bay Cockle incident was the Gangmasters and Labour Abuse Authority, the GLAA, which has been in place since 2005. As I say, the government really pushed at the time to create something around that. There was definitely learning to be had. And that continues to make progress using its powers under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act of 1984 to investigate serious cases of labour exploitation brought to its attention. So in 2019, when I was doing some of this, some of the information and statistics are not that readily available, or sometimes they're a little older than you'd think they would be. So the only available thing, for example, for the GLAA, they conducted over 226 operations in 2019-20 across a range of sectors. Now those sectors, some of it was horticultural, as I mentioned, but they're starting to see increased scenarios in either residential and domiciliary services, which Angela referenced. And there's an annual report there in the bit if people want to go off and find out a bit more around what they're doing at the moment. Okay, so the National Referral Mechanism. By now you'll be asking, oh, what's an NRM? Now some of you will know that. They go, oh, I know what that is. So the NRM is the UK system for identifying and supporting victims of modern slavery when they come to the attention of officials. So submissions are through a digital referral form by a first responder. I'm going to come on to a minute about the first responders, because a first responder is not everybody. It's an acknowledge that some agencies may not be the best place to be a first responder. So when the information first came out around this, there was a very clear expectation that, for example, health authorities would be. So, for example, hospitals. But there was a very clear recognition that that places hospitals in a really difficult position. Because if you've got somebody coming to A&E that's really not very well, their health issues, you don't want people putting that off because they think they're going to be reported to immigration in some way, or part of perhaps not understanding the national referral mechanism. So in that case, and now it's recognised that health are not expected to be a first responder with that. So first responders, for example, identified as statutory agencies like police, local authorities, the GLAA, who make a lot of referrals. Police certainly make a lot of referrals, but non-statutory agencies like Salvation Army, Migrant Help, example. But just bearing in mind that we don't want people to think, oh gosh, I can't get immediate health access to health because of the concern about reporting. So what happens then is referrals are assessed by caseworkers in what's called a single competent authority, who then make decisions on potential victims of modern slavery referred. And there's a two-stage bit to that. And you can ask at one point, well, why do an RM referral? What's the benefit? So the single competent agency assesses the application in two stages. One is reasonable grounds. And based on the information that's presented to them, does it align either with other information that they may have? And this is why it's worth bearing in mind what the NRM is about. And it's a system for identifying and supporting victims of modern slavery, because what they have is the more national picture. And if you've got 15 different people mentioning a Bob that lives in this particular area, then actually you start to get a much more credible picture around what's going on, which then assists the police and the Home Office to actually act. Now, once you've been accepted from the reasonable grounds, then the government has in place a support system which allows for accommodation and subsistence. So they will find accommodation that's generally provided by the Salvation Army. They have a link with that. Sometimes that will be local to where the individual has been identified. Sometimes that will be miles away, and it might be the right reason for people to be miles away because they don't want to be found in any way, or they don't want to be found or contacted, or any repercussions from that. The second stage is a conclusive grounds, and that will be once the single competent authority has done more investigations or found out more information. So a positive initial outcome leads to the individual receiving interim accommodation and subsistence to support them whilst actions are taken to support them through any criminal investigations of the organisations, and or to facilitate their repatriation to their country of origin as applicable. Because bear in mind, if the police are progressing a criminal conviction, they want to kind of make sure the person is supported. This may be, it's a key victim with evidence to support any ongoing convictions. So it's in the interest of the police as well to make sure victims are appropriately supported. So some statistics. For 2024, there were 19,125 potential victims of modern slavery were referred to the Home Office, representing a 13% increase to the preceding year. And it's the highest number in a year since the NRM began in 2009. Now, that kind of makes sense if you consider that I think modern slavery and how modern slavery is identified as broadening out. You can see how that's getting higher and higher with it. So the vast majority of those were sent to the single competent authority, and a much smaller percent, like a quarter, were to the immigration enforcement competent authority, which undertake the same bits as the NRM or the single competent authority. The most common nationalities referred for that year were, and this may come as a bit of a surprise to you, is for UK nationals who undertook 23% of the referrals, Albanian were 13%, and Vietnamese 11%. And that shows you it's a shifting pattern, because at one time you certainly Vietnamese individuals were with that, and Albanian's been there for a little while, but UK, that's, to me, that's a broadening. If you think about county lines, you think of that forced labour scenario, you can see how that's now become a big thing. However, somewhat disappointingly, and I point these out because these figures were much higher some years ago, but they're smaller now, is 53% of the reasonable ground decisions were positive, which says actually 47% were not positive. Now, that's not to say it might be the person's not able to describe their situation terribly well. It might be that there is no grounds for that person to be identified as a victim of modern slavery. It doesn't mean to say they don't get support, because there are other avenues to support victims. Just because the NRM has said we don't think you're a legitimate victim of modern slavery doesn't mean that person's going through persecution or exploitation. But also providing the person with access to some support while they wait final conclusive grounds. So that for me is interesting around the whilst in one respect we're broadening the idea of modern day slavery, somehow we're reducing some of the actions or the outcomes for people. So when we get to the second stage, 56% of that decisions were positive. So that's half again of what the original half was. So it doesn't says to me, don't put all your eggs in one basket, that something's going to happen. I think it's important when we're first responders that we bear in mind what support is available to people that perhaps don't get a positive decision. Now, the other bit it's worth bearing in mind here is that the NRM referrals are based around consent and the person consenting to that of an adult, not as a child. As you're a child, you're expected to absolutely complete that NRM referral. But for adult, it's important to identify that person's consent, or whether you think they may not have mental capacity to give consent, you would then progress it. But what we have is a duty to notify, and that's almost telling the NRM is, look, these are the circumstances that have been brought to our attention, but the person does not want this formally reporting. And there'd be a lot of reasons why people don't want it reporting. It might be fear of concern, for any kind of harm coming to their family back in their country of origin. It may be that they made a decision that, the current situation is not brilliant, but it's better than nothing. And they're worried about what would happen if that wasn't in place. But we all have a duty to notify with that. And what we're seeing now is, again, a really significant increase in that from the previous year. And it's the highest on record again, with like 5,598 duty to notify submissions. very briefly, and this will talk a bit more with Angela, is in 2022, the government opened skilled worker visas to overseas care workers in a bid to tackle record staff shortages in the care sector. I'm not going to make this political, but there was some pretty significant development, which suddenly meant that an awful lot of people, which arguably were maintaining the care sector, left. And what that meant was the significant challenges in that field. So the government, whilst it was well intentioned, set up this government open skilled worker visas. They broadened it to incorporate care workers and provided sponsorships that organisations could apply for, which would allow them to recruit internationally and bring the people to the UK with an expectation they'd be supported, there'd be a job to come to, and there'd be regular income. The expectation was the individual wouldn't be paying for that. That would, any costs incurred with that would be linked to the organisation. However, under a BBC under Freedom of Information request, the number of times a company had its sponsor license revoked in the UK in 2023, it was 336. And that would have been through reports of dodgy practice in some way or form. If you recall, there were some scenarios where a number of people had been taken on board, but actually there was no office, there was no system, because it all came about so quickly that some of the applications were not appropriately vetted, and the government recognised that and started to change. So in 2024, there's 1,514. So what that means when a license is revoked, it means that individual no longer has a job, and therefore they don't have the right to be in the country, and they have a short window of time to identify another sponsor who will take them on. Of that number, 1,514, over a third were in London. Now that tells you, one, it might be that's where the work is, but it's certainly to bear that in mind as you're going forward in your work, really. I won't go through this, but this was a GLA case example where somebody had come along. They'd come from India with an expectation that they were going to have solid hours. All of that thing would all work really well. But she disclosed to the GLA officers that she was being pressured into working long hours, harassed on her days off to work, forced into signing paperwork, and had been threatened with being deported. The company also threatened to make false allegations against her to the authorities if she did not comply. And as Angela will contest, we're seeing lots of this. Absolutely, we're getting at least a couple every month with that. So the GLA have a victim navigator, and this is why it's important we come onto the steps about making sure we engage all parties, because the victim navigator can often assist with people identifying another sponsor that might be able to take that person on with it. But often, to bear in mind, if people don't have employment and they may be paying out of their wage for transport, for accommodation and various things, that person is pretty much destitute if they have no money coming in. So that's why we're seeing these come along to us. Right, I'm going to stop for a break shortly. So somebody asked about indicators. So now I've told you all the various bits around it. What are the indicators for us? Now there's no, I could have 15 slides around this, but it will give you a bit of an idea of things to be looking out for. And some of these may not come to your attention. They may not be part of your everyday job, but for some of us, they most definitely are. I mean, one example that we've started to do now, when we do quality assurance visits to providers, we will ask them the percentage or the numbers of their staff that have been recruited through through sponsorship arrangements. So for some, that's a very small percentage, but we certainly come across one agency where the sponsorship arrangements equate to about 80% of their workforce. Now, why that's important is making sure that they recognise that people may be disadvantaged by the fact that they've come to the UK under sponsorship arrangements, and they may not know their full rights with it. But for us, in terms of making sure we're aware of the market and the care market, if that provider was to lose their sponsorship licence, that would be a number of people that would have no work. But it may mean that actually at very short notice, we may need to find alternative care packages for people. So that's why it's worth us knowing really those situations. So some of the indicators might be around withheld passports and identity documents. contracts, pay slips, bank information, health records. That's definitely we've seen. Lack of information about rights as workers in the UK, as well as support and advice services. And some of the things we know with organisations is we expect them to have a document that they make available to all of their staff that outlines their rights and where they can go to if they're not happy. Lack of information about a person's rights as a visitor in the UK. Acting as if coerced and controlled by another. Going missing for periods. Fearful emotional about their family or dependents. Limited English, for example, only having vocabulary relating to the exploitative situation. Excessive overtime, certainly seeing that. It goes from one extreme, from somebody having no work at all, and then people just never having a day off. Restriction of movement, noting the victims are not often locked up, but movement can be restricted or being held in isolation. Withholding wages, and we've started to see that coming through now, most definitely. Or debt bondage, and what that means is big chunks of money has been taken out of their wages to pay for their sponsorship arrangements. So abusive work and living conditions. Victims' wages paid into bank accounts of other people's names. I mentioned the McDonald's scenario there. So that's last year, really, really recent. Multiple employees having the same registered address, I mentioned, being threatened with handed over to the authorities. We're seeing a lot of that, actually. Being afraid of revealing their immigration status. We said this as well, is having the had fees for their transport to the country destination paid for by facilitators, who then must pay back by working or providing services in the destination. So just quite a few, like it's not a definitive list. There's loads of stuff out there. So the pathway we have for this is, so we'll circulate it round, is receipt of concern, and that will come in. Sometimes it's a direct email, sometimes it's a phone call, sometimes it's a direct approach through a site visit. It's not uncommon for a quality assurance officer or a safeguarding officer to be doing a visit to a provision and then to be kind of approached in the car park as they're leaving for someone to talk to them about a scenario. So the next bit we're advising is to discuss with the adult safeguarding lead or quality assurance lead, and or so that in this case for the moment would be myself or Angela with it. Or you can also make a referral to the multi-agency safeguarding hub, and the details are at the end of this session. Immediate actions, consider the involvement of emergency services and or safeguarding requirements to support the person or only impacted service users. And then consider signposting to relevant supporting agencies if it's required. That's really important. If you've got somebody that's, is really unwell, or they've suffered, an assault, it's making sure that we're clear around what needs to be involved with that. The next stage is our clarifications, information gathering. Check if the service is CQC regulated. If it's commissioned by the council. Sometimes it's commissioned by us. We'll kind of know a bit around that provider. And what we can do is then build a bit of a broader picture really around context. Share the concern with formal agents. So this for me is really important. As Angela mentioned earlier on, it's making sure we get the right people involved in the room, because quite often the Gang Masters and Labour Abuse Authority, for example, may know about a provider already, and the police will, or the Home Office will. So there might have been other concerns raised around that sponsorship, for example. The next bit is renegotiation. This is unlikely to be a lot of people on the training session here, but certainly from a local authority, adult social care perspective, we would look at planning a meeting with, say, QA and adult social care. We'd look to convene that within 5 working days with key partners to discuss the impact, any kind of breach of contract, for example. One example of that is part of our contracts with providers is that they will pay the London living wage with that. That's a clear expectation. But we're starting to see some of these cases coming through where the contractor is not paying that. And that's a breach of our contract with them. And we're starting to see those things coming through. And at that point, we'd also give consideration of an NRM referral being made, for example. So we had a scenario recently where we're about to do an NRM referral around the individual, but then we spoke to the individual themselves. They didn't really want that. And what they said is, actually, they were over here. They had a partner that was working, and actually they were in the process of securing an alternative sponsor. So sometimes people are really resourceful and they trundle off and they do what they do with that. But it's making sure that we give consideration to an NRM referral where that's appropriate. The next session is recording actions to make sure everything is recorded appropriately. We know what we've done. Should we be asked to either contribute to any kind of criminal convictions going forward? And then closing the case. Now, closing the case would, for me, would be when appropriate assurances have been provided and actions completed. So I'll talk this very quickly. So making an NRM referral. So obviously identify a potential victim, a first responder, as mentioned, and it's taking their account. So consult the potential victim and say sometimes they don't want to give us that, but sometimes they will, and they'll give us all the details with that. We'll gather that information, we complete the NRM referral, which I say is an online form designed to do that. The issue for this sometimes adult social care is we don't do these every week. So sometimes they might have nothing for months, and then suddenly it'll be like, oh gosh, there's an NRM referral, and it's making sure we support people when these come along. And then really sometimes it's waiting. The response time is actually quite quick for the competent authority when they make a decision, and they aim to do it in a couple of days. So sometimes the issue for us will be around accommodation for that individual, identifying that's often it's liaising with housing where the person is identified as vulnerable, because not everybody that's subject to modern slavery would automatically be identified as an adult at risk, for example, under the Care Act. But key considerations, I've come across this a couple of times in my job, when there's a worker who started to listen to the account of the person and then kind of made a bit of a decision. They think, oh, I don't believe this, and having to intervene and go, well, the role of the first responder is not to judge the account provided by the victim. It's really important. We don't know that situation. We don't, and we're not there to do that. We are there to make sure information gets appropriately passed on, really, and the support provided to the victim as they're telling us. It's not for us to decide, oh, it all sounds a bit dodgy. It's not. There's digital system, we said about consent with that, supporting information. You don't have to support everything there and then. It may be more information comes to light, and what you'll have is as a number, then you can somewhat additional information to that as it comes along. So I won't go through all of these, but as you'll see from here, this is a bit of a snapshot really of the stuff that's available for individuals that come to our attention. And you'll see it's quite broad. There's a lot of stuff out there. And also there are some specific charities that will support particular migrants from particular areas of the world, which speak their language, for example, and all those things. Because we're certainly seeing people coming across where the expectation is they've been able to speak English, but it's become quite apparent very quickly on is that they're not able to speak English in a fluent way. But the support mechanisms are out there. So that was absolutely whistle stop with that. I'm going to stop sharing. And then if there are any questions, examples that people then want to talk to, or any clarification on it for the points raised with it, or anything you want me to go back on. So hands up. Anybody? Elaine.
Thank you. That was really interesting. And this whole notion of organ harvesting, really, it blows my mind. And, you know, whether people are knowingly doing it or not knowingly doing it. But this might be a very naive question, but where are they taking them to theatre and doing it?
I think, from my understanding, when you read the case, it was somebody that had come over on, I think it was a student visa, if I'm correct. So there's something when you come, as you know, when you come to the UK, you are able to access things, aren't you? You're able to access services, because I think was it brought up in a private hospital? You might, because I know what you're going to say, and there's a code of ethics here, shouldn't you be twigging some? And I think that's how it kind of came light. Somebody's like, hang on a minute, I thought I was going for this, but I'm not. Somehow I've signed up for this. So I think that's how it's come about. But I don't think it's anything like the back of a garage anywhere. I think it was formally done through hospitals. Yeah.
Thank you. And I suppose Angela's comment then about care agencies now is really quite shocking. And yeah, you know, obviously we get people through Whip's Cross that make comments about their carers, but obviously we put in the safeguarding adults referral, but perhaps that's just something for us to be more cognizant about. Thank you.
Yeah.
I would be really grateful of that from my position.
answer that. Ellen?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I just really wanted to kind of comment on what you were saying about the cases, you know, the percentage half got through and then half of that half got through. So it interests me just because situation that I've been aware of, I mean, I'm in health side of things. Someone who had married freely abroad and come to the UK, but then the situations kind of emerged that actually it wasn't perhaps what they thought it was, and now there's some duties expected of that person and those kind of things. But you know, some of the cases that may trigger thoughts about slavery but would not necessarily be I've forgotten the terminology used, but you know, wouldn't be classed as so. So that was just really interesting, because I think there's, you know, on the fringes of it, they're still very serious and people living in damaging circumstances. But you know, and then how we link in people with the right support. So it was just really a comment. Really, it was very helpful. Thank
I
you.
would just say with that, we're starting to, the bit for me, forced marriage is, because my background is managing a learning disability team some years ago, and we were seeing kind of forced marriage, certainly with people with, let's say, often with mild learning disability. We had a couple with people with quite severe to moderate learning disability who were perhaps traveling abroad and then coming back with a married partner and going, oh, good gosh. And then the expectation that that person would then not quite twigged that they are now the full-time carer for somebody with that. And that was not remotely what they thought they were buying into along those lines. Or we've had scenarios where somebody, the primary carer, has gone off and married somebody else and brought them back with the expectation you're now going to be the full-time carer. You're not going to get a break and you're not going out. So as I say, for me, the bit around modern slavery is that really broadening from what people originally thought modern slavery was, around the idea of like the pop-up brothel. If you remember, sometime there was an issue around car washers. You know, licensing were doing a big target on that because we identified that was where people were being exploited really to do that, working long hours, cleaning cars in like Brent Cross car park, but no one had twigged all of that. And a couple of years ago, I was doing the safeguarding lead job in Hackney. There was an issue around Vietnamese nail bars, where you've seen people very clearly being part of that. But so that the demographics are changing, and I think it's ever shifting. So that idea of seeing forced marriage now within this is certainly, it's not that unexpected, but same because it's been around such a while. But yeah. Any other questions? If we just go through some of the original bits, so defining modern slavery and have the information to share with clients, and that came from Ellen. That was you. Job done?
Yeah, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Job done. Great. Cordelia, reporting lines.
Yes, that's fine.
Are we happy with that?
Yep.
Excellent. Good. All right. Monique, what are the new trends? Is Monique still with us? No, we lost Monique. Okay, lost Monique. I think I would say we covered the new trends. Do people think we've covered the new trends? Okay. And then we've got Sheffo. Please apologize, I've got that wrong. Sheffo, what are the signs of modern slavery? Is that right? Okay. I think we've got that. Are we okay with that?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Okay. Excellent. In fact, you've even said, I'm glad my question is answered. All good. When you share the presentation with us, absolutely. You'll be getting that. Obviously, we might look at it, is any updates that's come from today that we might want to add to or whatever. But I think we covered most things. Okay, we've still got time, folks. That can I rattle through it, I think. Is there anything, Angela, you want to add to the end about like the current cases? Because they are challenging, but I think the most appropriate way we've dealt with them is that multi-agency approach, and that's what we want to be kind of supporting here, is that multi-agency bit, because we all have a part to play with it.
I mean, I think we have to do quite a bit of investigative work once we get an allegation come in, and that could be like, so for example, we had an allegation that people that had been brought to the UK on a UK VI license had had to pay for their visas, and then we managed to work it back to a premises in Waltham Forest that was sort of registered with Companies House as being a home care agency, but was actually just a residential home, just a normal, you know, family home. So we as officers, particularly QA and safeguarding, we've been round to premises to kind of scope things out. We're happy to talk to individuals, make contact with them. And I guess the feeling that I've had from individuals is that they feel safer in a way talking to somebody from the local authority than they do perhaps talking to somebody from the Home Office, like in the first instance. So we're kind of like the friendly face of this situation, if you like, and able to spend time listening and identifying ways that we can support the individual. Would be kind of what I'd want to add to that. But I think for us, in adult social care, the biggest issue that we do have at the moment is the UK VI sponsorship licences, and the Home Office do take steps to suspend and revoke licences. But oftentimes the information is coming to us from regarding a provider that hasn't had their licence suspended or revoked. So we then have to move that up the chain while supporting the individuals.
I would just add to that. I mean, it's worth bearing in mind sometimes people don't necessarily want to lose their employer. What they want is they want a good employer. So they want an employer to change their practices. So sometimes we can do that because it might not lead to a sponsorship being revoked. But what we can is we can intervene with that practice, because once we're involved as the council, generally speaking, that employer will kind of go, oh, okay, right. So one of the things that in my last borough we did is we worked with this provider that was, I kind of recognised there's a kind of power imbalance, I think, for their employers, and they hadn't twigged that at the start. Well, I think they had, but they just ignored it. But the notion was getting them to realise that, look, you employing somebody from another country is not the same as you employing Doris that lives around the corner, right? Because Doris that lives around the corner can tell you to go and do one and get another job. She can do all of that. But if you've got somebody that's come from another country, there's so much invested in that. There's so much financially invested in that, that they're unlikely to say, no, this is unreasonable what you're expecting of me, and I'm off. So the bit we worked with one provider, I remember, is we did a kind of knowing your rights document, which we then said, we want evidence that you've circulated that with all of your staff. So we're assured that all of your staff know these are their rights in the UK, that they have that. And that they did it. They also, I was really quite impressed actually, because they found themselves an organisation that was able to come in and do a bit of work really and information, and said, look, if there's any kind of issues, please come along and let us know about it. So sometimes some providers are really on board with it, and they'll go, okay, because it might be they've not necessarily been involved in some of the other aspects of that whole journey, from somebody identifying an application somewhere, another part of the world, leading to you then suddenly being in the middle of Chingford. You know, that's quite a journey, and there'll be lots of other people involved in all of that. But it's good to see the government taking notice around this, because I think it was done at such speed that as much as it was well intentioned, people were really quick to jump on it and exploit it, I think. And I think for me, being a safeguarding lead, it kind of came out of nowhere. I remember that. I'm sure Angela will say the same. It was like 1 minute, you've got the other issues would be general whistleblowing, really. And suddenly we had all these scenarios which can make you feel a little bit inadequate, because there are times when you can't really do anything around that arrangement other than make sure people have got the right support to assist them through that. Because it's not often an adult safeguarding issue with it, but sometimes it might well be because it impacts on. So if somebody's working all of those hours, then that's got to impact on the quality of care that you're probably providing to individuals. Most definitely, they're not getting a break on those lines. So sometimes it's actually thinking what down the route, this is likely, it may not be obvious, it's about Doris, but it will certainly be something around the impact of that person's ability to undertake their role. And also they're feeling exploited and depressed. We all know there's times when we have to have a day off because you're just not feeling it. Really, you're not in a good place to be able to be positive and upbeat with people we support. But if that's your day to day, those are your earnings, it's going to have an impact.
And
Now,
I think it is important to get that feedback if you do hear feedback from the residents or patients, wherever, because we've identified situations whereby, you know, residents have advised us that the carers are actually sleeping in the downstairs of the property because they've got nowhere else to sleep. We've had situations where the carers have pretty much moved in because, again, they've got nowhere else to go. But the recipient of the home care doesn't really want to say anything. They're kind of more worried about the individual and not realising the wider implications of that. So sort of any feedback, I think, is really important to share, because then we can look into that from a quality and safeguarding perspective.
Thanks for that, Angela. So this is the bit where if I don't get this right, Catherine's going to be coming for me, is making sure we get the people are able to do provide feedback. It's on there's the feedback slot on the if I just share my screen. I'm just conscious of the best way to do it, really, Catherine. So I show my screen. That should be what you're seeing now, yeah?
Yeah, so once we share the slides, there will be this little hyperlink on which you can do the feedback, but I'm also very happy to share the forms evaluation feedback link on the chat. And just to say that it's really helpful to get feedback and helps us kind of adapt our training to whatever's most useful to yourselves. So please just take a moment.
That'd be great if you could put that in the chat as well, because I'm conscious that we get these out to people certainly, hopefully today, if not tomorrow morning. Everything's up to date on it. So let me just go through, make sure. It's been too quick. This is at the end. So the other thing the resources have here is around resources. So it's around MASH requests, because it may be not able to go through Angela and I. MASH requests, they will come and find us to do it. Signposting support for victims. There's quite a lot of information. So like I said, there's a lot of resources out there. There really are. Way more than I ever remember. Been doing this job for quite a while. Then we have the kind of pathway, making an RM referral, and obviously the website that we have information on our website for it, for the Safeguarding Adults Board. So that can either go there, can't it? Or you're going to put something in the chat.
Yep.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Excellent. Right, there we go. Right, folks, with 2 minutes to go, is there any other burning questions before you crack on with your energy for the rest of the day? Is that okay? There we go. We finished with 2 minutes early. So Angela and I and Catherine will catch up later to dissect it all and see if it's kind of worked. But thank you for your engagement. It's much appreciated, and I hope you all got something from it and are able to kind of circulate it.
Oh, yeah, so you. Thank you.